So this is continuing a series where I asked you guys for questions that you have, and then I will try to answer them to the best of my abilities. And one of them that I got that I thought was really interesting is, why are Christians so judgmental? And so that prompted me to think about some of the questions I asked you earlier. So what does it mean when people say don't judge me, or don't be so, you're being judgmental? What did you guys decide was what were the reasons for that?
They want to do what they think is right, and what they want to do. And when you tell them not to do that, they feel offended by it.
Yep.
People don't want other people to tell them that they're doing wrong. They want to, I don't know, think that they're always right. Even if they're not.
Right. People want to be able to set their own standards for what's right and wrong.
They don't want to follow the rules.
Right. Externally enforced rules. People don't like that, right? Yes?
Well, sometimes I think that I'm better than another person, and so like, oh, why do you tell me to do it this way? I'm better than you at this. Like, you don't judge me.
Sure, because you think you're right?
Yeah.
Yeah. Yes?
They're like asking me, like, what authority do you have that makes you, like, right to tell me what to do?
Yeah, great. That's another. So where do you get your authority to say that something is right or wrong?
Like, it's a lot of the root is pride, I think. Like,
What do you mean by that?
like, people, when they say that they're being judged, like, who are you to be judging me, to be telling me what's right and what's wrong, because I have the authority of myself.
Right, it's that sense of I'm in control, and how dare somebody tell me what to do? Yeah.
It's kind of my way of saying that I know I'm doing something that most people would view as strange, but I'm not really going to change, so there's no point in, like, trying to give me those looks like, Rachel, what are you doing?
So are you using it as kind of a defense mechanism to make people back off?
Yeah.
Yeah. Okay, good.
Maybe some people know that they're doing wrong and they don't want to change, and they say, why are you judging me? But they are really...
Yeah, I think that's kind of along the same lines of sort of deflecting criticism or somebody else trying to tell you what to do. And I think that's true. There's kind of when people think about judgment, it's usually there's the negative term of I'm assessing what you're doing, and I'm defining that what you're doing is wrong, and I'm going to tell you about that. As in, you're lying and I don't like it, or whatever it is you're doing, and then I'm going to say that's a bad thing. And so some people find that offensive. In fact, most people find that offensive when you tell them they're being terrible. There's another side of that, though, which is kind of deciding, is making decisions about what is right and wrong. And we make decisions all day long, and everybody does this, about what we think is correct to do. Because we have to make decisions about what to do all day long. And that starts early on in the morning, whether you yell at your mom for trying to get you out of bed in the morning or not. And so there is a decision to be made there about what is right and wrong, as you're making a judgment about that as you're going. And the Bible does actually talk quite a bit about judgment. I've selected a few passages which I think kind of summarize what the Bible has to say about judgment. So if you can hit the next slide. So one of the most frequently quoted verses in the entire Bible is this Matthew 7:1 verse, which is, do not judge, or you too will be judged. So based on, and people will quote this saying, say, you can't judge me. You should not judge me. And other people will say, well, I shouldn't judge other people or other actions or try to determine what's right or wrong, because otherwise I will be judged myself. But that would be taking this out of context, because if you go to the next slide, this is a fuller picture of what he's actually saying, which is, he says, do not judge, or you too will be judged. For in the same way you judge others, you will be judged. And with that measure you use, it will be measured to you. Why do you look at the speck of sawdust in your brother's eye and pay no attention to the plank in your own eye? Some versions say log. How can you say to your brother, let me take the speck out of your eye, when all the time there is a plank in your own eye? You hypocrite. First take the plank out of your own eye, and then you will see clearly to remove the speck from your brother's eye. So he's really not saying don't judge. He's saying don't judge unless you have your own house in order, essentially. Basically, don't be a hypocrite. Hypocrites what is a hypocrite?
Someone who says one thing and does the opposite.
Yeah, somebody who gives off the impression or states that they have a certain set of rules, but then they don't actually follow those same rules themselves. And one of the things that you find throughout the New Testament when Jesus is talking is that this is one of the things that he is most strongly against, and often is mad at people for being a hypocrite. And the Pharisees and the scribes tend to bear the brunt of that criticism from him for being hypocritical. So really, the verse about do not judge or you too will be judged ends up being more, if you read the context of this, more about hypocrisy rather than about judgment per se. But there are some other ones that do talk about judgment. He talks a little bit further, if you go to the next slide, about hypocrisy, and that he says, "Woe to you, teachers of the law and Pharisees, you hypocrites! You clean the outside of the cup and dish, but inside they are full of greed and self-indulgence. Blind Pharisee, first clean the inside of the cup and dish, and then the outside also will be clean." As in, you're pretending that on the outside you are living this perfect life so that you can then turn around and condemn people for doing the very same things that you are doing. Rather, clean your heart, get your own life in order, stop doing bad things, and only then can you talk to other people about trying to correct their life. And hypocrisy is really about pride. It's saying, I'm better than you, and that's why I can tell you that you are doing the wrong thing. And we all struggle with pride and want to give off the appearance that we're doing well in life, or that we're following the rules, or that we're smarter or faster, or whatever it might be, than we really are. And if you look at what's popular on television right now, so have you guys watched the so-called music television recently? I really don't watch that channel, but what's on music television, which is MTV? What's on MTV these days? Is there any music on there anymore?
No.
What's on there?
Teen Mom.
Which is what kind of television show? It's a reality television show. Why are reality television shows so popular?
Everybody's perfect.
Because everybody's perfect in them?
Well, and except for
You feel better about their life.
Exactly. So they have a number of people who are clearly on the edges of what's socially acceptable, and everybody can look and say, look at these people. Look at how terrible they're behaving. So I'm not so bad. I'm doing quite well because I am not doing what they're doing. And so you can see that reality television is very popular, and it's for that very reason, that we want to be able to say we are better than other people and we know what's best. And Jesus confronts us. So if you go to the next slide. So this is the story that everybody, I'm sure, is familiar with, but it's about the Pharisees and scribes bring the adulteress to Jesus and ask him for judgment. So he says, this is in John 8:2-11. At dawn he appeared again in the temple courts, where all the people gathered around him, and he sat down to teach them. The teacher of the law and the Pharisees brought in a woman caught in adultery. They made her stand before the group and said to Jesus, "Teacher, this woman was caught in the act of adultery. In the law, Moses commanded us to stone such a woman. Now what do you say?" They were using this question as a trap in order to have a basis for accusing him. But Jesus bent down and started writing on the ground with his finger. And when they kept on questioning him, he straightened up and said to them, "Let any one of you who is without sin be the first to throw a stone at her." And again he stooped down and wrote on the ground. At this, those who heard began to go away one at a time, the oldest ones first, until only Jesus was left with the woman still standing there. And Jesus straightened up and asked her, "Woman, where are they? Has no one condemned you?" "No one, sir," she said. "Then neither do I condemn you," Jesus declared. "Go now and leave your life of sin." So the problem with the Pharisees and the scribes here is they are accusing this woman of adultery and condemning her essentially to death when in fact they're all sinners, as we all are. And Jesus is confronting them because the scribes and the Pharisees are notorious for trying to portray that they're upholding the letter of the law without actually being very interested in internally having a heart that's right with God's rules. And so he confronts that hypocrisy where sinners are condemning another sinner. I also want to note that when Jesus at the end is admonishing her, he doesn't say, "You horrible sinner, stop doing that." What does he say? He says, "I don't condemn you either, so go now and leave that life of sin," which is actually, I think, a pretty gentle way of encouraging people or instructing her that she needs to stop sinning without being terribly confrontational about it. So there are further passages which talk specifically about what are we supposed to do about people within the church. And I want to talk about that first. So if you go to the next slide, which is Matthew 18:15. If your brother or sister sins, so if a fellow believer or another Christian sins, go and point out their fault just between the two of you. If they listen to you, you have won them over. So we are actually supposed to confront our fellow believers if there is obvious sin that they're committing. So how does that reconcile with what we just read? If you go to the next slide, Luke 17:3 talks a little bit further about this. So watch yourself. If your brother or sister sins against you, rebuke them. And if they repent, forgive them. Even if they sin against you 7 times in a day, and 7 times come back to you saying, I repent, you must forgive them. So there's a sense of, yes, you must confront them, but on the other hand, you also need to be able to forgive people when they are repenting. And that is about believers. So, yes, there is a sense that we can judge because we are supposed to know what is right and wrong. The Bible lays out pretty clearly in God's Word what He thinks is right, not what He thinks, what is right and wrong. And so we should know those things. And when we see that in other people and other believers, then we should have the courage to actually confront that. And why is it important to confront people who are Christians who are in the middle of sin? Why is that important to confront them?
Because then they might stop doing the sin and not continuing it.
Right, so you can get them out of sin. Why is allowing people to stay in a habit of sin a problem for a Christian?
Up front row to
Ah.
right.
Like, it could be the root of other sins and it just builds on itself.
Yeah, so sin has a tendency to kind of snowball in people's lives if it's left to run unchecked. As in, you start drifting away from God's will, and sometimes that just continues to pull you further and further away. And obviously, we want to help people stay close in their relationship with God and as right of a relationship as they possibly can. Not that people can earn their salvation clearly, which I'll talk again about later. But and they do talk about what do we do when we see sin not in a believer? Should we be judging them? So that's the next one. So in 1 Corinthians, Paul is talking about this. I wrote to you in my letter not to associate with sexually immoral people, not at all meaning the people of this world who are immoral, or the greedy, or swindlers, or idolaters. In that case, you would have to leave this world. But now I am writing to you that you must not associate with anyone who claims to be a brother or sister, but is sexually immoral, or greedy, or an idolater, or slanderer, or drunkard, or swindler. Do not even eat with such people. What business is it of mine to judge those outside the church? Are you not to judge those inside? God will judge those outside. Expel the wicked person from among you. And I think that it's pretty important to note that he's saying specifically there, it's not your job to judge the people who are outside of the faith. That's God's job. And I think that's a pretty important thing, as in, if you know somebody isn't a believer and you see them sinning in some way or living a life that is not glorifying to God, then are you supposed to confront them about that? Are you supposed to judge them? I think it's pretty clear that you're not supposed to judge people outside of the faith. But we are supposed to try to make judgments about what people who are inside the faith are doing, and is that in line with what God wants, the way that God wants us to live. But how do you actually confront somebody who, let's say somebody in this room that you knew was obviously sinning in some way? How would you confront them? What would you do? Would you do that? Let me just say, how many of you would confront a friend of yours if you knew that they were sinning?
Depends.
On what?
What they did, like if it's like they murdered somebody, or if it's like they were mean to somebody and they didn't be like. Let's say it's a close friend who's really caught up and seems to be addicted to pornography. How many of you would confront that person? Okay, so this is a close friend. So a lot of you would not confront that person. Why would you not confront that person?
That's
seems like more of a personal. I mean, maybe if it was a really close friend, I might feel comfortable talking to them about it. But it seems like that's more on the personal, spiritual level that might be better dealt with by a youth leader or their parents. So I might tell their parents about it.
Yeah, let's say you're an adult, and one of your adult friends is caught in, like, very close adult friend is doing the same thing. Would you confront them then?
Possibly.
Okay. Other thoughts on why you might not?
It's awkward.
It's awkward.
Are they Christian or not?
They're a Christian friend of yours. Yes?
I just feel so underqualified to like.
Sure. Not feeling prepared for that kind of conversation.
I might not, because I read this somewhere. It said talking about pornography is dangerous because it stimulates sexual thoughts, which is exactly the opposite of what you want to do.
So you should allow somebody to continue to view pornography so that you don't give them thoughts about pornography?
That doesn't really work.
Brian?
Yeah, I had a conversation this week with somebody that was thinking about applying for a job somewhere, and I said, hey, they've got pornography in that store. Is that something you really want to tempt yourself with? And I even thought, should I even say this to them? And it's like, no, it's the right thing to do. It's a believer. This person's a believer, and I was like, I need to tell this person this so that they're aware of the sin they may be walking into. Because as a young man, you don't need to be around that stuff, and it's tough enough as it is out in the world. And I felt compelled to say, hey, be careful of this. I don't want you to stumble. And he was very appreciative of it.
Is this a friend of yours or somebody you knew well? Or
Somebody
not?
I know.
Okay.
So.
Yeah, I think there's a lot of reasons why people wouldn't. One is they don't feel like they have a relationship with that person. They don't feel qualified with that to do that. There's a risk involved, as in if you confront one of your friends, what if it goes badly and you end up like sort of breaking the friendship over this thing? So there is potentially a risk involved with that. And so Jesus does call us to, or we are called to confront these things, but we're called to do that with compassion and love. And so I think there's a few things to pay attention to. One is relationship that was brought up. It is really difficult to change people's minds or help them change behaviors if they don't know you or you don't know them. I mean, can you imagine just imagine you're walking down the hall at school, and if you don't go to a school, imagine you're walking down the hall at a school, and there's a person there you don't really know, and they're obviously doing something that is harmful to themselves, and you go up to them and tell them, you can't do that, that's sinning. How effective do you think that would be? Yeah, so if you don't have so one of the fundamentals is having a relationship with that person and choosing who you talk to and who you confront about this thing, I think is really important. If you don't know that person well enough that you can have a deep, meaningful conversation, you're probably not the right person to be confronting them. Another thing is that you should be sure of the facts, as in, if you've heard through the grapevine that somebody is doing something they shouldn't be doing, confronting them about that is likely to be ineffective because you don't even know what you're really talking about. So make sure that it's something you actually know about before you do that. Another thing that we talked about being qualified for that is before you confront them, read the Bible and find some Bible verses that you can rely upon so it doesn't come across like I'm telling you this is a sin, rather it is a sin because see in the Bible here's what it says. And we're talking to fellow Christians. We're not talking about talking to a non-Christian at this point. So having that source for where you are drawing this conclusion that this is a sin can be very helpful. I would encourage you to pray before you confront them. So one, that is just good because you need God's help. One, to know that you should do it, and two, to know how to do it. And two, there's there's some benefit to, and B, there's a benefit to having some time pass. So in the heat of the moment, if you see something happen and there's a strong emotional response, somebody gets angry, or something happens, it's good sometimes to allow some time to go past. And there's actually, like David is one of my favorite people in the Bible because he screws up and yet he's still one of God's favorite people of all time, it seems. Not that God plays favorites, but in the Bible it appears that he's one of God's favorite people. And he is actually allowed to be in sin with Bathsheba for a full year before Nathan confronts him about it. And so there is something to the idea of time being important and allowing things, if they're very emotional, allowing things to calm down so that you can have a rational discussion about it before you confront people. If you, much like we were talking about hypocrisy before, if you have glaring sin in your own life, and we are all sinners obviously, but it is good to confess your sins and try to address the sin in your own heart before you try to confront the sin in somebody else's heart. Sort of that idea of take the plank out of your own eye before you try to address the speck in somebody else's eye. Because otherwise you may be called for being a hypocrite. They may say, why are you talking to me about this when you are struggling with whatever it is that you're struggling with? So trying to right your own ship first helps. Paying attention to your heart is also important. I would say make sure that you're doing this not out of pride, because as we said before, a lot of times people judge other people because we want to feel good about ourselves. And we have a certain, I know what's right, so of course I'm going to help you be like me. And that's not really helpful. If you're coming from that point of view, then don't do it. If you're coming from the point of view of, I'm really worried about you, and I love you and care about you, and I see you going down the wrong path, then that's a much better place to be coming from. And people can usually sense which side you're coming from based on the language. Have you guys ever experienced that, where you could tell somebody wasn't really interested in your best interest when they were talking to you about something? I mean, it's fairly obvious most of the time. And then lastly, if you point out somebody's sin and confront them, obviously wanting to be there to help them through whatever that is important too. Rather than pointing it out and leaving, it would be staying with them, asking what you can do to be helpful. Can you be an accountability partner? Can you do something else to be helpful with them? Can you text them every day and ask them how they're doing with this? That kind of demonstration of relationship, I think, is really helpful. So those are just a few things I would encourage you to think about if you're going to confront somebody who you know to be sinning. And remember, that would be somebody who's a Christian, and this does not apply to people who are not Christians, who Jesus said, or Paul says that that is God's responsibility to judge those people. So if you go to the next slide, one of the other problems is this whole idea of distinguishing between right and wrong. And we make, as I said, judgments about this stuff all the time. And nobody seems to bat an eye when you say, well, I've decided that shaving my head is a problem. I don't think there's any moral attachment to that, but you make decisions about how you treat other people, whether you lie or not, whether you steal or not, whether you cheat on an exam or not. You make decisions about these things all the time. You're making judgments about what is wrong, and that is what is helping you decide what to do in all these different cases. When people say that you're being judgmental, it's often that they are either, they don't like that whatever standard you decided is correct, they don't like that decision, so it's against their lifestyle or worldview. Or people will say that there is no right or wrong at all. So when you guys were asking in your small groups talking about, are there any behaviors that are always bad, no matter who does them, when they do them, or where they're done? What did you guys decide?
Murder.
Murder is always bad? Okay.
I think we decided that, like, it depends on your point of view. Like, from a Christian's point of view, I think things can be bad, whoever does them. But, like, atheist that chooses to have no moral standard can say, oh, that guy did that, that's not bad. So it really depends on what you think about your own moral standard.
Well, that is true, but does that atheist think that anything is bad enough that they would get upset about it?
I don't know.
If they had a pet, if they had a dog, and somebody came and killed their dog, would they think that's bad, or would they not think that's bad?
Probably think it's bad.
They're probably going to think that's bad, and it doesn't matter who did it. It's always going to be bad. So even though...
It's gonna be bad.
What's that?
For the person that killed the dog, it wouldn't necessarily have to be bad. Because there are people in this world that don't think murder is bad.
That is exactly right. There are people who think that there are no standards. Well, they say that they don't think there's any standards. But people have a hard time living that way. If their sister's murder, they're going to think that's bad. Exactly. There's always something. Everybody has things that they think are bad. Whether that's, some people think that abortions are bad, and some people think that preventing abortions is bad. Now, obviously, those two can't both be accurate. But people, no matter where you come from on the scale of yes, or liberal or progressive to more conservative, all have views or have things that they will identify that are always bad and they're upset about. That might be the way women are treated, it might be the way the environment is treated, it might be how your sister is treated, but there's, in some way, they think that something's bad. Yes?
It goes against the Ten Commandments.
If it goes, sure, any of those, absolutely. Is that what you had too? Okay, stole your answer.
I said that the truth is not dependent on what people think about it.
That is an important thing, because if the truth depended upon people, as in if somebody, some person can define what's right and wrong for everybody, then how does that person get to be, how does that human being get to be the decider of that? Ultimately, that devolves into, if people decided what's right and wrong, then anybody can decide what's right and wrong, and ultimately it devolves into, well, what I decide is right and wrong is right and wrong. But nobody actually lives that way, because they all get upset about something, whether it's somebody stealing their phone or lying to them or whatever it might be. People get upset about these things, but if they didn't think there were moral standards, they wouldn't think that these apply to everybody else too. And they wouldn't think that's always bad. It could be okay. Maybe they stole my phone and that's just fine. I mean, nobody really thinks that. So they may say on the one hand that they don't think there's any moral standards, but they actually hold moral standards that they hold everybody else accountable to. That's bad, because everybody can think of at least one thing in this universe that would be bad for anybody to do, whether it's murder or torturing a 5-year-old for fun or whatever. Just think of the extremes. There's always something that people think are bad. If you think that morals are relative, and that's a fairly common thought these days, is that all moral judgments are permissible, they're all equally valid, and that there are no absolute truths when it comes to these things. What's funny is that if you think about how they express this, they're really saying that here is a truth, and the truth is this, that there is no truth. Is really what they're saying. So therefore, what I just said can't be true.
So there is truth.
So it is true, but it's not true.
So there is truth. If they say there's no truth.
Right, exactly. There is truth that there is no truth, which means there is no truth, which means it's just never, I mean, you're in this weird never-ending cycle of contradictions, so it just really doesn't work. So the whole idea of moral relativism really defeats itself. There are no moral standards other than that there can be no moral standards, which means there's a moral standard, except there's not. So anyway, that worldview really doesn't work. And if you think about it in if you simplify the language and don't get buried in some of the language people use to describe this, it's actually pretty easy to see that it just is a nonsensical philosophy. So if there are moral standards, which there appear to be, where would they come from? They can't come from people.
China.
They come from China, exactly. Everything is made in China, right? So everybody lives their life as if there's moral standards. And one of the things I want to point out is that we like the fact that there are moral standards. Everybody does. It doesn't matter where you come from. There are some things that you like to believe are moral standards. One of the common things that I see among people is this sense that humans have value. Who would agree that human beings are valued? How many people think that human beings are all equally valuable? Great. Why do you think that? If you ignore the idea that God says so if you are a non-believer in God, how do you come to the idea that people are equally valuable?
All people are equally valuable except for me. I'm above everybody.
That is actually a common view.
Let's just stop right there.
Well, like, if you believe in, like, evolution or whatever, then, like, you all evolved from the same thing. You all came from the same thing. So, therefore, it's not like, oh, I came from dirt, I came from gold. Like,
Oh, but I'm evolved farther than you.
Sure, so we could all be, if we're all evolved the same way, then, but we're all evolved the same way that other animals are evolved the same way too, though, right? We've all reached the same level
But
of
then there's also
evolution.
this level of intelligence that's just beyond what the other
But
animals
I'm smarter
have.
than you, so I'm greater than you.
So, if you ignore that, so what do you mean by intelligence?
Like, well, if you look at what humans have built, like, we rule the earth. Like, you know, like, that's the dominant species.
We have changed the earth, absolutely.
Some people say so.
Aspect, and, like, if you look at, say, ants, they build ant hills, that's like the extent of their kingdom. And we have built cities and roads that the ants have built ant hills.
How about coral reefs? If you look at the size of the coral creature and the reefs that they build, it's astronomical. It's actually interesting you bring up that, that's a good point. So, chimpanzees have better memories than humans do. People are like, what? No way. So actually when you look at like number sequences that people have to memorize in order to like punch in like numbers in this computer that will churn out some kind of like a candy bar, chimpanzees can remember a longer series of numbers than a human being can. Elephants have a bigger brain than we do.
Well, duh, we've got a big head.
There are a number of other animals besides human beings who actually seem to be self-aware. So elephants, dolphins, most of the great apes, all appear to be aware of themselves.
What do you know?
Dogs are not. Meaning that you can conceive of yourself as a thing. So they use these mirrors, this is kind of an aside, but they use these mirror studies and they paint a dot on the head of the animal and they look in a mirror. And if the animal is smart enough to actually like investigate their own head because they can tell that the thing in the mirror is actually themselves, is kind of a higher level ability to understand things. So what I'm saying though is that evolutionarily, yes, we are superior in many ways to other animals, but there are animals which are better than us in a lot of different things. Certainly there are animals that are faster, bigger, stronger, whatever. So I'm not sure that that necessarily means that we are superior to them.
But it's a very
It's coming.
perfect combination of all those things.
Like, if you put it at, like, we say humans are all equal, because, like, we're all the same level, like, we're all people. Like, people could think apes are above us, but they're all apes, or fish are below us, but they're all at the level of fish. Like, we're all people at the human level.
So if you look around, so how would you say that we're all, if you don't believe that God says, or that something else is telling us that we're all equal, if you look around at the world, and I take care of, I'm a physician, so I take care of patients in the nursing home who are non-responsive, laying in bed, can do nothing for society. Like they don't interact, they don't communicate, they don't respond to anything. Is that person, if you don't say that they're equal because something else is telling you that, is that person equal to you
Do they have
in
money?
value? What's that?
Do they have money?
That's actually a separate point, but it's a good one. So if you look at it from that biological sense of what they could do, I would say that not everybody is equal. You know, some people are artists, some people are musicians, some people are smarter, some people are better athletes, some people are prettier, some people are whatever it is. There's differences among people, and are we all really equal? Some people would say that it's really societal input. So your value is dependent upon how much you can contribute to society. But there's very clear differences between different people have different skill sets and different abilities. So it would be hard for me to understand how you could conceive, if you look at it from that standpoint, that everybody is equally valuable. Yes?
Is the point of this to show that you really can't base your opinions on anything? You really have no biblical standpoint?
Well, that is actually a good takeaway, but that's not where I'm going exactly with this. What I'm saying is it's hard to establish value, like human value being equal, that we're all equally valuable, if you don't have an outside standard telling you that that's true. I just don't know how you can actually really logically come to that conclusion. If you look around at the different skills, abilities, and capabilities that people have. And let me tell you about two people that I've interacted with recently. One is these are both medical students that I talked to, and one of them was a 25-year-old woman who, after high school, she joined the Peace Corps, worked for 2 years digging wells in sub-Saharan Africa to try and help people get clean water. Came back from that, worked in a nursing home, and after that worked in a homeless shelter. After that, actually volunteered while trying to get into medical school and going to college. She volunteered at a food pantry, and I was like, wow, this is awesome. Why do you do this? She's like, well, people have value, and I want to help those people who don't have as much to get ahead. Another gentleman that I just talked to the other day, he volunteered with hospice. Hospice is a program for people who are in the last 6 months of life, so they're all terminally ill in some way. And so he would volunteer his time to spend with these different people who are suffering. And his favorite person to be with was actually a woman who couldn't talk to him. And she was in her late 50s, and she wouldn't talk to anybody. She was a former marathon runner, and all she would do all day is walk the halls over and over and over again. And so what he took upon himself was to just walk with her and talk to her while she walked for a half hour a week, which doesn't seem like a lot, and she never acknowledged his presence. She would just keep walking, and it didn't seem to matter that he was there. So finally, about 3 months into this, he was walking about halfway into this half hour. She turns and looks at him right in the eye and smiles, and then goes back to walking. And he was like, wow, she actually knows I'm here. And he felt like that was providing value or valuing her and recognizing her dignity and showing that he cared about her, and she seemed to recognize that. So he thought that was great. And so two different people, and they both thought that humans have value regardless of whatever they bring to society, how much money they make, or anything else. The first woman I talked to actually belongs to a freedom from religion organization.